On behalf of the Martin McGuinness Peace Foundation, I want to thank you all for joining us here this evening. The Foundation is conducting a number of interviews with people who knew and worked with Martin, and tonight I'm joined by Mitchell McLaughlin. Mitchell, thank you for agreeing to come along and do this. You were a friend, a neighbour, a comrade of Martin for many, many years. But what's your first memory of him?
My first memory is when Martin might have been about 8 years old, and I was 5 years older than him, and we were playing football in what is now Meaning Field in Dove Gardens, but then it was known as the Cinderfield, one of the few football pitches, apart from Celtic Park, that was available to us. So he was a goalkeeper, or thought he was a goalkeeper. I was playing for the opposition. But, both Martin and his brother Tom were actually, already at that stage even been, noticed as people who were good at sports. And then their younger brother Paul came along, who possibly was the best footballer of the three of them. So a very sporting family. But from that time, Martin and I, we both went to the Brow of the Hill Christian Brothers. I was at the technical college, Martin was at the primary school. And we just, we were constantly kind of coming across each other in terms of schoolboy football initially. No politics at that particular time.
But obviously later on you became involved with the politics, with the Republican movement. And what was your sort of meeting with Martin at that time?
Well, the earliest kind of time in terms of politics was the street protests over things like poor housing, or indeed evictions. And, people calling for, jobs. And what emerged out of that, was a broadening kind of civil rights struggle, but we didn't realise that was the direction of events, very historic events. But, we'd have met there, and then 5th of October changed the agenda dramatically when the RUC attacked the 5th of October march. I don't actually know, when I think about it, if Martin was there or not, but it would not have surprised me if he was, because he was at the other marches, as I was myself. But from there on, it was a regular kind of occasion. Sometimes the protests were spontaneous, sometimes they were planned, sometimes there were, there was protests as a result of the Paisley's kind of gang who were protesting or counter-protesting. Each time there was an attempt to have a peaceful kind of protest about, as I say, housing or employment rights, and indeed, the voting rights. So all of those kind of issues meant that we had a very early kind of coming together on a programme that was to last us for the rest of our lives. Only we didn't quite know that at the time.
But obviously that period of protests and the whole thing around the Bogside, the attacks on the Bogside, and then the B Specials, the British Army, and then moving into conflict. What was your relationship with them around that period?
So I returned to Derry in March '69. And almost immediately, Martin and I hooked up again. He was on the streets and had been throughout that period. We were in William Street. As it happened, I was in the company of Harry Devaney. And there was what had become known as the Saturday matinee, which was the 3 o'clock riot, which happened every Saturday. And so we were sitting on the windowsill. My brother-in-law John Shields and my brother Joe, when the RUC tried a kind of a pincer movement, and they charged down William Street, up William Street, and came in the back of what was then a building site, which would be Glenfarra Park and all of that now that is being developed. So we just scattered. Harry Devaney run into his house, and I think that's the trigger. That's what happened. The RUC kicked the door in and come in, and as you know, Sammy Devaney became one of the first victims. A man called McCluskey was actually the first victim, again a victim of RUC attack. He was battened to death in a shop doorway in Dungiven, and he died a few days before Sammy Devaney. And, you know, that really, at the end of the day, particularly, you know, when the RUC just closed ranks and, you know, didn't allow them thing to be, even yet to this day, nobody's ever been identified or charged. And the papers of the official investigation have been repeatedly blocked from publication by the British government. So those issues, I think, you know, at the end of the day was politicising not just Martin McGuinness or Mitchell McLaughlin, but everybody that had, you know, had a head on their shoulders and had eyes to see and ears to hear what was going on.
And many people will have seen interviews with Martin in the Bogside. Clearly very confident the way he came across. Clearly a leader of republicanism in the city at that time, and that developed. What was your relationship with him at that time?
Well, obviously, I mean, we always had a very strong friendship, and it was a very honest friendship. You know, we could say a lot of things to each other that we wouldn't maybe have let anybody else say. But at that time, I wouldn't have described him as confident, but very committed. And if he saw it as his duty, he was very, very strong-willed, probably more than anybody I've ever met. Now, I mean, I'm quite certain that there was other people of a similar determination and commitment. He was an unbreakable man, and if he was convinced he was right, but he was intelligent, as you could see. You know, they stuck a camera in front of him, you know, as a young kind of 21-year-old. And he already sounded like a veteran because he answered the questions. He handled them. You know, you could see he had politics as well as, you know, a rationale for what he was doing. He was being questioned about, you know, if there was, you know, the possibility of being able to kind of resolve these issues and whatever, you know, and he was able to deal with those questions on the basis, yes, I mean, people should talk, and if necessary, and if they're proposals, then we'll make sure that they're passed up the line to the leadership. You know, he had the grasp of how you should respond to those kind of issues, really from the start. And, you know, I don't want to kind of fast forward too much, but when it came then to things like electioneering and electoralism, it was a dream candidate. You know, and you could have run him nearly in any constituency, and he did run in a couple of different constituencies, not just in Derry. And I mean, I was his first director of elections in the prior. You might remember the prior assembly that was proposed after the hunger strikes. But in that whole kind of period, and I don't want to jump over what was, you know, really I think the foundation stone of the peace process that eventually emerged, the real one, because there were a number of sham kind of peace proposals. There was an attempt in the middle 70s in the IRA called the Truce to facilitate talks, but they're only been strung along by the British government, and this went on over the period from the middle 70s to the you know, the end of that decade. Different points of contact, a number of people locally, I suppose, maybe been doing it for honourable reasons, but they ended up, you know, being used as patsies, like delivering messages that were meaningless, that weren't going to resolve anything and weren't going to lead to anything. But you know, if anything, that demonstrated that even as a young man, Martin McGuinness, as a leader, was prepared to think and talk about and respond to genuine opportunities for peace. But he was also prepared to go on fighting if that was the only option.
You talked there about Martin's politics and how he was able to address issues. For those of us who didn't know at that time, he came across as very confident. Maybe just, as you say, we didn't know him, but clearly, as you say, he already had leadership skills.
No, he was a leader, you know, and he was a great leader. You know, he just, as time went on, he just was growing more and more into the role, and no matter what challenge was presented to him, He would have rose to the challenge. But the fact is, a 21-year-old being described as a commander, addressing the media, and in those kind of days, no black and white television. It was a mystery to a whole lot of people, that kind of engagement. He just he was like a natural, because he answered the questions. He wasn't fazed by the either the prominence or the question of the questionnaire was putting to him. He heard the questions, and some people get a bit excited or nervous and don't quite get the nuance or don't quite get the question. But Martin caught the ball every time and responded to the issue. And it did that earlier. It's one of the first interviews he ever did, and it's been shown countless times. But you can just see, in that very young, with very little experience of dealing with the media, what capacity he had, and what eventually emerged in terms of being a national leader.
You talked there about that period of 75, 76, when you described as being people were being strung along, that Martin was prepared to react and reach out the hand if it was needed, but also determined to continue that fight for Irish republicanism. And he had taken up a leadership position at that time, along with yourself and the like of Jerry, who were all national leaders of our party. How did that sort of dynamic work? What was Martin's role within that? And in particular, obviously he was appointed as one of the people who was lead negotiator with the British government. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, the hunger strike period obviously propelled a lot of people into speaking roles that they didn't, including myself. That was my initial kind of experience of getting on a platform. I was a Derry delegate from the National Hits Block campaign, and so during the hunger strikes and each successive, the situation just got more and more terrible, as you know, through that year. And there were many times when a situation would just completely go crazy, and it needed very, very strong leadership. And Martin was always to be found in the middle of that, just kind of exerting himself, bringing it under control, or giving leadership and showing people what they should be doing, rather than just kind of venting their anger in a confused or irrational way. So he was growing into a role that was based on the fact that he knew himself what he needed to do, but all of those who were close enough to him, including myself, could see that he knew what he was doing. His leadership was effective leadership, and he could be very rational and could be very cool and calm. Even in circumstances of somewhat kind of dangerous circumstances, he could think clearly, and his advice or his instructions were usually to the point and effective. So through that period of the deaths, right up until the end of it, and then what emerged at the end when the hunger strike ended in October that year, the feelers went out again. But this time, the balance had changed because of the elections and the by-elections that had arisen out of the prisoner candidates that was put up in the British general election, where Bobby Sands was elected, and then the election in the south, where all of the prisoner candidates received very, very substantial votes, and of course, 2 of them were elected, and 2 others just barely missed being elected to Leinster House. That smashed forever, and they never got the ground back again of Thatcher's kind of main platform, which was that the IRA was a criminal organisation with no politics and no popular support. And here was the proof, In fact, Bobby Sands got more votes in his by-election than she got in hers. And what was so in there, and Martin was one of the first to talk about it, was the seeds of another strategy in addition to armed struggle. It was be given, if you like, the Sinn Féin role was redefined, because they had no role because they were excluded from politics. You had the New Ireland Forum and all that nonsense where they went round in circles, came to agreed conclusions that would haunt them now when they'd be read back to them with the United. No, they're all very strong United Irish because they didn't believe it was going to happen. But they were all agreed that Sinn Féin shouldn't be there. Republicans were excluded, and when they eventually got delivering their report to Thatcher, she said out. She just dumped a lot and humiliated them. And that's the point where Hume realised that he wasn't going to deliver any of the things that he wanted to do unless and until it became inclusive. He was never going to agree with republicanism, but he was sensible enough to realise that he couldn't do a deal separately. He couldn't do a deal based on the premise that the Brits weren't talking to the people that really mattered, and that the people who could deliver peace in Ireland. And at that stage, he wasn't. And I would say this without in any way detracting from the contribution that he made, because it was tremendous. But his realisation was that he couldn't deliver it. He needed an alliance with us. And that became the basis of that kind of conversation that developed from that period. Pryor announced his rolling devolution. We announced that we would contest the election, and that we wouldn't be attending the forum as it was structured unless there was going to be an all-Ireland dimension to it. And the SDLP were forced onto that ground as well. They were also forced to kind of say in advance that they were going to abstain from it. So Martin was put up as our candidate in Derry, and I was as Director of Elections, and it's the first time either the two of us had ever voted in our lives, at least knowingly. I kind of half suspected the old Nationalist Party for a start, and maybe the SDLP had been using our votes for us.
You're talking about a time when the primacy of politics was coming. But Martin had been involved in negotiations with the British government in 1972. And obviously then, throughout the years, there'd been contacts on and off with the British government reaching out to the Republican movement. And then Martin was then again appointed as that sort of... What was the thinking behind that appointment?
Well, the fact is that he had that kind of pedigree anyway. But he also had charisma. He was good in terms of the media, which was very important, because what people don't understand about the peace process is that the British strategy was to kind of isolate and exclude republicanism, and then the process to convince everybody that we had two political ideas to join together. But Martin McGuinness was just an absolute contradiction of that, and he was a Republican who was not afraid to fight, but who was not afraid of peace, and wasn't afraid to kind of tease out his ideas with other people's ideas. In our terms, when the negotiations, and there had to be a very, very tight control over what was negotiated about, what was the agenda, what was the agreed position going in, and what was the limits of what could be agreed or conceded. Martin McGuinness was just, absolute master of all of that. His ego never got in the way. They couldn't cajole him, they couldn't intimidate him. He would deliver the Republican analysis and propositions. Just invite people to go away and think about them, talk about them, and we'll meet again. And he had that ability to just to kind of hold the line. And he was working with, as you probably know at this stage now, at times there would have been a very, very significant gathering of people from leadership positions right across the island of Ireland. And they would have been coming together, and that can be very fractious kind of stuff, and everybody wants to say and whatever. But whenever that was refined down and there was an agreed position, then absolutely the outstanding person that you could pick on to deliver that message in the way in which we wanted it delivered and would stay on message throughout the engagement, no matter how long, no matter how intense, no matter how dangerous, and would, would give you a report back on the engagement that was precise and to the point, and allowed judgments to be made as to what should happen next. And I think his gift, really, at the end of the day, was that because he was so obviously fearless and competent, that the Brits came to realise that when he was saying that Republicans were interested in peace, that they could depend on it. They could start to kind of explore that and build on that. And, that's like a eureka moment for some of those, because like their British colonial history had a way of getting in the way of some of these people. They're all very polished performers, and I met quite a few of them over the years. Had a great sense of themselves and their Britishness. But, that whole kind of colonial history had made victims of them as well, in some ways, because they had their own worldview. They had a sense of privilege and entitlement that didn't cut any ice with Martin McGuinness.
You've said about Martin having taken on that role and being able to deliver on it, deliver a message, to engage with people. And that was very important, given the movement a very public face. And then as that developed, obviously through Martin was then elected on any number of occasions, sort of following that. And that again was a very public face for the movement. But then at some stage, and we all know the sort of history of the DUP decided to engage with the process. Now, it's been said that Tony Blair and company were very sceptical, that Martin convinced them that the DUP would engage, to hold their nerve. And then that happened.
Well, let me tell you the way that was. And Martin was central to it. It was a bit like hokey pokey in and out, like Trimble was making deals with us. And I mean, I can remember one occasion, storming Castle, Blair coming out and shaking hands with every one of us and says, we did a great day's work. We were at it for about 12 hours. And this was 4:30 in the morning. He was flying home. We had a deal. And Adam says to him, before he got on got onto the helicopter, he says, listen to the 8 o'clock news in the morning and you can see whether we've got a deal or not. And of course the Ulster Unionist Council had been reconvened overnight and Trimble was turned over as he was. So Trimble, I think, was to give him credit, Trimble was prepared to make deals when he was confronted with deals, particularly when the governments would line up on the proposition, whatever it was. We weren't getting everything we wanted either, but he was pragmatic enough to recognise that, and maybe like as an unseen positive influence and a bit of a hero or heroine was Daphne Trimble, his wife. She's a very strong woman, very political, a very clever woman. And I think she sustained Trimble because it must have been very demoralising for him to be reversed so often and to be overturned so often. So back to the kind of the point where the game changed. There was so much of that, it became obvious, and it was Martin said it, we will never be able to build a sustainable deal with David Trimble, no matter how hard he tries, because the structure of the Unionist Party means that council can just double guess him. He can negotiate all he likes, but they will decide, and negatively. Don't forget Arlene and Donaldson and all the rest of them were still in the Unionist Party at that stage. So he put it to the Brits, not that he thought the DUP would do a deal. I've seen that reported, but that's not the way it was. Okay. He said, if we're going to get a deal out of unionism, it's going to have to be with the DUP. That's the way he put it. It's going to have to be with the DUP, because Trimble is looking over his shoulder at the DUP and at the Ulster Unionist Council, and we're wasting our time. So, 2007, it emerged, and there's a whole lot of kind of, to and fro and in between, but you can guess if Martin had taken on our behalf on the task of convincing both the Irish government, the American government, as well as the British government, that Republicans were serious about a peace deal and succeeded in that, then he was saying to them, as long as you're not running interference, then give us a crack at doing a deal with the DUP. And we get a deal that could be sustainable as a deal that we would do with Paisley.
And obviously we all know that came to pass. But reflecting back on something you said earlier about Martin's ability to engage with people, was that part of the thinking of putting him in as Joint First Minister at that time to work with Ian Paisley and to work with the DUP?
Well, if, in a sense, having kind of come up with the initiative and then, sold it internally and then sold it to the sponsoring governments and the, eventually the DUP, there was actually no option. I mean, you worked with Martin a long time yourself, so you know that there was no ego involved. There was an indomitable kind of determination, but no ego or personal kind of aggrandizement in it. And Paisley, I'm sure he made a big decision and took a big risk, and I think paid when he lost his church and he lost his position of leadership in the DUP as a consequence. But it was probably the only positive thing that Paisley had done in his political career. But would he have been prepared to carry on with it if Martin had stepped aside and says, now, by the way, you're going to be working with somebody else? So it was part of the deal, and it was part of the trust between the two of them. Paisley wasn't going to double-cross Martin. He was going to play games with him, right? The Chuckle Brothers and all this here, and my deputy and all this crack. But I mean, Martin just laughed and enjoyed the crack, but stayed on focus, stayed on message.
In talking about that there, you were sort of saying about, Martin was able to sort of see that and make the deal. And we have heard it said afterwards, after Martin's death, by political leaders that if Martin McGuinness took a deal with you, you knew he was going to stick with it. In a sense, that obviously must be part of the thinking, even for Paisley and company. Well, here's somebody, we might not like the person, he may be our political opponent, but if we strike a deal with him, he will stick to it.
Well, I mean, the thing that often kind of come across to me, not just from talking to Martin and working with him, but and meeting other people as well in this whole kind of process over the years, you get people that you really only knew from the television, and you maybe had a wee sense of them, that don't like them, or don't like what they're up to, or completely disagree with them. But you actually discovered that when you meet some of these people in the flesh, not all of them, I have to say, because there are a lot of professional rogues about as well, but you're dealing with people who actually believed in what they were doing, even though it was on the other side of the fence from us and they were very dangerous people to be having an argument with, that they had integrity as well. So there's a lot of that kind of can be found in your enemies as well as in your friends. And I mean, Martin was just as, he was so kind of self-contained that he could take that risk of, you think, okay, maybe I can do a deal with this person. And then they screw you over, I mean, he could see through the likes of, we even got back to the early days of Wilson's government and the approaches that was being made then. And, Merlin Rees was tittering about the place, He could see what was real very early on. And he didn't waste any time, because he didn't have any time to waste. He was always busy. It's one thing or another, or one crisis or another that he had to get involved in. You think of all those funerals over the years as well, where you could just see his steel as well as his leadership. So all of that was in Martin McGuinness, but you could and you do see it in other people as well, even those who are on the other side of the argument or the dispute. And that's the kind of thing that, gets into your head is, we can do a deal here. Because we're dealing with people that have a bit of backbone if it comes to it,
Not only just in identifying, where you said Martin has identified those people, but he also had a way of engaging with them. It was a very human sort of thing. It was very sociable. I mean, we watched it build up a connection with Paisley and then with Peter Robinson and then with authority, so he had that sort of skill to really engage.
Well, he had, and I mean, if you were with him in the education department, weren't you, or were you?
No, it was Aidan.
That was Aidan. Well, see, in the education department, he went in there as a Republican, and they didn't know, these civil servants, they didn't know who they were going to get, right? And what does this guy, I just know him from the papers and what the papers tell us about him, and what the media say about him. And, you know, the flag was flying in the building and all when he went up. I mean, he just ignored all of that. He sorted it out eventually, like he just sorted it out in his own time, but he didn't get trapped into any of the obvious kind of provocations. But see, at the end of the day, so they were standing around in tears whenever he was standing down from it, you know, when he was coming out of it. And he had a great relationship, a good team around him. You know, and we had access to them, like, for the first time because of his influence and authority. Whenever we were making representations on behalf of constituencies and whatever, lots of access. But you could actually see that that there was a lot of loyalty and admiration of Martin as the head of the education authority, or the education department. And you know, he went round schools, and every school he could get into, he was in it. You know, and they weren't all nationalist schools by any means, and they weren't all Gaelic schools. You know, just he went where he could make a difference or where he could make an impact, and he was winning people over, right, left, and centre, parents as well as children. You know, you hear the Minister of Education is coming to school. You know, the school gets a good cleaning, and everybody puts on their best suits, and they invite, you know. The children are all kind of coaching, maybe singing songs and stuff like that, you know. And he just loved it. He was in his, you know, element in those kind of circumstances, where maybe other people might have been slightly nervous about, I wonder how this will go. He just kind of took control and absolutely calm and confident and relaxed, and made everybody else relaxed around him, you know.
For Republicans, Martin was very clearly figurehead for us. A national leader and someone who inspired confidence. I mean, you've heard people say before, it's okay, if it's good enough for Martin McGuinness, it's good enough for me.
Yeah.
He had that respect for the Republicans. But what's his wider legacy, do you think?
Well, I think that, I mean, his legacy is still forming, because I think he has set in train a series of events, which I believe is going to see the peace that he had defined and spoke about all his life and fought for. It's going to be delivered. It's now unstoppable. Nobody, I think, could predict with any logic just how long it's going to take. In my view, you know, both governments are slowly kind of coming to the realisation that there really isn't any point in investing in protracting this, you know, because it's not going to go away, and it's certainly not going to get any easier. So sooner or later that's going to happen. At that point, I think you'll see Martin McGuinness's contribution taking concrete form. It was a work in progress, and it was taken from us too early. He still had more work to do. He knew that himself. But I mean, all we can do is just carry on and finish the job that he started. But it would be unfair to kind of just, you know, stop at the point at which he was taken away from us, because I think he has created all sorts of momentums and dynamics and friendships, goodwill, broader perspectives. Those are all the kind of the building blocks, you know, where people kind of come to an acceptance of something that maybe at an earlier time they would have completely rejected without even thinking about. He made them think about, you know, well, maybe there is other possibilities. The thing about Paisley is that turned out to be a massive kind of foundation stone for a lot of those unlikely kind of alliances and opportunities that emerged. And he had the imagination to recognise that, you know, we could do deals, we could be talking forever, and every fortnight have a crisis whenever whoever was the leader of the Unionist Party. But you weren't concretising the gains that had been made. It was but like Groundhog Day. You started over again at the point at which the Ulster Unionist Council had stopped Trumbull. But Paisley even though they took him down eventually, you know, the gang of 4 it was at one stage, and then it ended up being a gang of 12. You know, and they pulled Paisley down. But you know, I think we broke through the invisible wall whenever Martin cut a deal with Paisley. And the two of them made it clear that they both thought each had done a good thing, and you know, so they mutually kind of accepted each other on the basis of mutual benefit. You know, Paisley, I think, would have the greatest difficulty in walking away from some of the purely kind of negative stuff. Martin's legacy will forever be associated with his role in the IRA. But you know, he demonstrated that he had a noble purpose and vision, and you know, it included the people that he was fighting against. You know, a better future for them as well. So I think that is the kind of legacy that Martin McGuinness has created. But we won't be able to sign off on it yet because of still a bit of the work that he started. We still have to finish.
Will you say his memory will always be associated with the IRA, but it's too early yet to finish writing his legacy? But where does that sit? Because as much as his legacy might be associated with the IRA, Martin was also reaching out to reconcile. So how does that part of the picture fit together?
Well, I mean, he wasn't fighting. He never was, in my view, even as a young man, a very young man, a very inexperienced member of the IRA, he never was fighting out of anger or resentment or, you know, blind, you know, venom. He had a purpose, which was to bring about peace. And, you know, had there been a peaceful way, I mean, Martin McGuinness done civil rights marches. I mentioned that, I think, earlier on, along with myself. And I know. So, I mean, if the Irish hadn't attacked us with batons, you know, we'd have been walking along singing songs and holding each other's arms, you know, and on to the next march. But you weren't allowed to do that, even that. So the state was attacking. And, I mean, Martin McGuinness didn't go to war. The war came to Martin McGuinness. And, you know, whoever thought that was a good idea made a mistake, because Martin McGuinness, as, you know, I mean, I could mention Bobby Story as another one on the mould, you know, just people who are completely and absolutely clear about why they're fighting. And it's nothing to do with anger and resentment, it has to do with ending injustice and giving everybody a fair chance.
So, thank you very much.